Thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Paris Schutz. Property taxes won't go up in Mayor Brandon Johnson's first ever budget.
What I present here today is just our first step towards a better, stronger, safer Chicago.
Mayor Johnson unveils $16.6 billion spending plan with no property tax hikes, but details sparse on how to close a $500 million gap and whether there's enough money for the migrant crisis. City Council members get into a spat over a resolution supporting Israel and condemning the brutal Hamas attacks.
A group whose stated purpose for being is to kill Jews.
More plans for migrant shelters foiled as buses keep arriving. In Washington, Republicans in disarray as the U.S. House of Representatives still does not have an elected Speaker of the House. And in sports, Blackhawks rookie phenom Connor Bedard gets his first goal. And the Bears look to keep the momentum alive this week against Minnesota. And joining us on our Week in Review panel are Rick Pearson with the Chicago Tribune, our very own Heather Sharon, Laura Rodriguez-Preza with the Chicago Tribune as well, and Cheryl Ray Stout of WBEZ. Let's get right into it. Heather Sharon, this just happening within the last hour. A lot of activity at City Hall, protests, counter-protests, debate over a resolution about the situation in Israel and Gaza. Set the scene for us.
Well, this was a resolution introduced by Alderman Deborah Silverstein, who's the only Jewish member of the City Council, that asked the city to condemn Hamas's attack on Israel. And it became a really big flashpoint after Alderman Rosanna Rodriguez-Sanchez objected, saying that the resolution should also reflect the reality that millions of Palestinians have been living under Israeli occupation for decades, and to center their humanity and the violence that they are now confronting now that Israel is retaliating with a bombing campaign and threats of a ground invasion. So that resolution was approved this afternoon on a voice vote. Alderman Rodriguez-Sanchez was the only alderperson to ask to be recorded as voting no.
And before this happened, I mean, it was kind of an unprecedented situation where things got so testy in the council chambers that the mayor basically had to clear everybody out.
That's right. When Alderman Silverstein rose to speak, she was heckled by members in the gallery shouting free Palestine and accusing her of encouraging genocide against the Palestinian people. That prompted Mayor Brandon Johnson, who has been deeply reluctant to remove people from the city council, even when they're creating disturbances, to clear the entire second floor gallery. Paris, you know I've been covering City Hall for longer than I should probably admit in polite company. I've never seen that happen before.
So it's certainly unprecedented, but it seems like no one heard or anything like that, and a resolution approved. Cheryl Ray Stout, I mean, this is such a contentious thing to talk about. Obviously, a humanitarian crisis happening right now, a war happening right now, but is there room for nuance here when folks talk about what's happening?
There has to find a way, because we got to have some peace. Otherwise, the core of all of us is getting destroyed by the anger and the hatred between both sides. And so we have to look at it with peace and hope that somehow, some way, there's some sort of resolution. And I don't know if that's ever going to happen, because we've seen this for years and years and years in our lifetime. But this seems to be a flashpoint of what's going on.
And again, we don't want to underscore the tragedy of what's happening right now, Rick Pearson, but in terms of how journalists cover this, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on the attacks on Israelis, and then there's folks that believe that there should be a broader context here in terms of the humanitarian crisis playing out in Gaza, and then the history of what's happened in the West Bank.
Well, you're dealing with kind of the traditional journalism of the here and now versus the deep dive kind of story and the more contextual story. And I think, you know, actually there has to be room for both. I mean, the brutality of the murders that Hamas committed and the kidnappings are, you know, that, as everybody says, that's their 9/11 in Israel. And now, as this war continues to develop, and I guess we do need some nuance here, because everything has become, as Cheryl said, it's both sidism. You know, you've got to be here or you got to be here. You can't nuance things. There's plenty of room for context here, but at the same time,
that's why it got so contentious in City Council, because, you know, and that's where it came down to the language.
Right.
You know, they condemning Hamas versus, I guess, expanding to recognize the broader context.
Right. I think what Alderman Rodriguez Sanchez was asking people to do was to hold two competing thoughts at the same time. You can oppose Hamas, which is a declared terrorist organization that admittedly murdered civilians, babies, women. There's no debate about that. But at the same time, you can recognize that the Palestinian people have been living in really terrible conditions for decades without any really hope of a homeland and sort of self-determination. I think that's what she was asking for. On the other hand, Alderman Silverstein said simply, that's fine, we can have that discussion. Now is the time to condemn the largest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. We can deal with the rest later, but now we have to stand with an ally that's been the victim of a significant terror attack, which she likened to September 11th as well.
So obviously these debates happen across the country and the world, and we've also talked about some possible threats to places in Chicago that the police are watching. No known threats right now. Laura Rodriguez-Perez, I want to bring you in here. Let's get to talking about the budget. One little aspect of this budget here: $150 million set aside for new arrival services. The cost has been a lot more than that so far, has it not?
So far this year, I think we're already past 300 million, if that's correct, Heather. So that's less than half of what they've spent so far. And I don't know that there is going to be a stop to the people arriving. So we see that number increasing day by day, mostly. And so what the mayor's office is saying, though, that they only put 150 aside because they want to make sure that state and federal government also realize and acknowledge how difficult it is for the city to, use that money for the migrants, and they want them to also participate in finding a solution.
I was just going to say, Rick,
there is no state money.
Lawmakers are not eager to go back and approve some kind of new state money for this.
Well, I think you would be hard-pressed to have the legislature approve a supplemental and new state money here. And I mean, we're seeing in this migrant crisis the kind of the fraying of the fabric of some of the base of the Democratic Party, with the underserved populations saying,
Yes,
okay, we recognize the human aspect of this, but where was this money when we have these homeless people? Where was this money when our neighborhoods were crumbling? Why all of a sudden now? And I think a vote would flat out lose in the Illinois House.
And we heard Mayor Brandon Johnson acknowledge that today in a virtual press briefing with reporters, saying that he planned to ask for more money to care for the migrants as part of the regular budget process that kicks off in January, which I think is an acknowledgement that with both Governor J.B. Pritzker and House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch coming out and tossing not just a little bit of cold water, but a whole bucket of cold water on this proposal, realizing that this is going to have to be essentially a fight for the city's mid-year budget and the state's regular budget process.
And
What about the federal government?
Well, then that's what I was just going to say. That's really been the advice from Illinois leaders like Pritzker and Welch, is call Joe Biden. Right. Call Joe Biden.
And it doesn't seem like anyone's ready to the rescue on the money part of it yet.
Well, one, who's in charge in Congress right now? You don't have a functional Congress to do much. Right. Obviously, the federal government and the White House could repurpose certain monies and grants. But I mean, I do think, in an overall sense, what you might be seeing here is that Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, got what he wanted.
Yeah, we've talked about that. I mean, this is exactly the kind of political infighting, the kind of crisis
as well
that we're seeing is what they want.
As well as having Democratic leaders acknowledge
what those states have been going through for a while.
Yeah.
Laura, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, they're forgetting the human aspect of it, though, right? Like, we talk so much about money. And at the end of the day, yes, Greg Abbott got what he wanted, but so we walk around the streets and we see people, babies sleeping on the ground.
And I don't want to put aside the cold aspect of this.
And I think that right now, there has been, and you can, chime in on this, Heather, but I believe that there's been a push to also have other cities step in and help, but I don't know that that's been very well received. Juliet's mayor was against the $8.6 million that the state had allocated to help migrants in Juliet, and I think that they weren't expecting for that response.
I think that was more of the way that the Joliet Township kind of
Handled
handled
See,
the
this is
But
what
he
we've seen.
attended
This is
that.
what we've
He
seen.
attended that meeting.
This is what we've seen in the city of Chicago too, because once again this week, more pushback to potential shelters, for instance, in Amundsen Park.
Right, yeah. I mean,
there's still the open question of where these massive winterized base camps are going to go, how quickly can they be erected, but Laura is exactly correct. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 people sleeping at police stations and O'Hare, and I think it's important that we sort of center their plight, especially because fall is here. It is not summer anymore.
It's already
it is
cold at
only
night.
going to get colder.
very
What
cold.
are we doing for processing some of these people? Maybe getting them some work, being able to work,
Well,
going to
that's a
school.
whole
So
nother
that's a
bottle
whole
of
another,
wax.
you know,
Yeah.
I feel, and I think that it goes back to money, unfortunately, because even though Biden's move, which is I think the only move from the federal government to acknowledge the crisis has been to extend TPS, which is a temporary protected status, which will essentially allow work permits. But the process to do that is very, very slow. People
and
are,
you have to pay.
and they have to pay at
expensive.
least $500. It's a $500 fee. But a very big, thing happening here now is that there is not enough legal aid or pro bono attorneys. These people are in this new city. They don't even know how to access this. So I don't know that I can see why the city still has no plan per se, because at the end
The
of the
only
day,
plan right now has been Pritzker's warning that it's going to get cold.
Right,
That's the
yeah.
only thing that is
Speaking
really
of the money, speaking of the federal money aspect of it, there was that story about Catholic Charities getting $48 million through FEMA. A lot of that used to fly
Right.
migrants here. Meanwhile, Chicago's only gotten reported $7 million from FEMA. Does that sound like an imbalance here in how this money's being spent?
You think?
And Catholic Charities, which is the agency that's getting that money to fly the migrants to Chicago, is also a city contractor in charge of finding more
Resettlement.
permanent housing
Yes.
for these same migrants. So I think what this crisis has shown is that the entire system has multiple faults and multiple break points. And I am hard pressed to think of a part of the system that has functioned as designed or as intended, to the detriment of, again, the men, the women, the children who are sleeping unhoused outside police stations.
Do we know
today.
any more about this Garda World contract for potential $30 million to build those winterized tent cities? Have we heard anything in the last week?
We haven't. The next step is for the mayor to say, I want to build these camps here. I imagine there will be some sort of community meeting, but he has the authority to execute that contract. It has not been executed yet. The big question will be if those camps are built, where are they built, and how are they run, and what sort of protections are in place for the people who will be living there, and what sort of conditions will those tents entail.
And again, to underscore just how difficult this is, the deputy mayor in charge of this, Christina Pacione-Zayas, she goes to these community hearings and
Yes,
she gets
yes.
pushback all the time.
Definitely. I've been to a couple of those meetings. I think that what Rick mentioned earlier is exactly what they're echoing, and their plea is sort of like, where is this money coming from now? Why wasn't it here for us? And they continue to say it's not that we don't want to support the migrants, which sounds almost cliche, but we do hope that there is a plan to also help our communities in the long term, right? Invest in our communities long term. And I think that at this point, I think that the mayor, there's no finalized plan on the 10 cities, but we have, sources told us that there has been more movement to open more shelters, and they're no longer looking for very specific buildings, just hoping to find warehouses. The shelter in Pilsen was an empty warehouse, and they're, so that people are not out in the streets.
Right. Well, it's a vexing problem we've been talking about every week, and it does seem like it's just going to get worse as the weather goes down. We should talk about the broader overall budget, $16 billion spending plan, $538 million shortfall. Rick Pearson closing that shortfall. The mayor's talking about the things that other mayors have talked about, efficiencies and tiff revenue, and $186 million in, quote, improved revenue projections. Does this sound like real numbers here?
No, but budgets never are. It's close enough for budget for government work kind of thing. I mean, certainly we have seen the TIF money is real money, but again, the purpose of TIF is to generate within the TIF, not as a general operating kind of expense line. I mean, one thing, in any other year, I would say I'd give a great deal of credit for uploading the pension funding,
Right.
which is something, but
Putting
that's,
more in than statutorily required.
yeah, and that's a good thing. But when you have these other challenges confronting you, I don't know if it's necessarily appropriate.
Well, some of that, Heather Sharon, the mayor was elected on these progressive promises. He talked about $800 million in new revenue he wanted to fight for. He's not really getting any of that. And much of that is going to have to come from the state. It's going to be very tough. So are progressives happy that there are only, a few little baby steps along the way to sort of his broader agenda with this budget?
I mean, there's a reason why Brandon Johnson spent most of the past month telling reporters that he was going to have 4 budgets to introduce as mayor, and that this was just a first step, and that nobody expected or should expect him to solve generational problems in Chicago with disinvestment on the south and the west side, and sort of a taxation system that perhaps falls hardest on working class Chicagoans and not the wealthiest Chicagoans. He says this budget starts to sort of right the ship, but it's like a Titanic ocean liner, right? You can't make any sudden moves because the whole thing falls apart.
Except there's a whole lot of icebergs out there,
yes,
not
indeed.
just one.
Yeah, so there are 2 new mental health clinics that will open in existing facilities. I think that's very important for the progressive movement. It also sort of solidifies as part of the city's operational system as the alternate police response to 911 calls from people suffering from mental health care. I think that is also crucial. There's also an understanding that the police department, I think, fundamentally has to change. Now, the budget isn't changing. The budget for the police department will just be a hair under $2 billion in 2024 if this proposal is approved, and I think that's going to be a little bit tough for some progressive groups to swallow. However, Brandon Johnson says, look, I'm taking 400 officer positions, that's sworn officers, and I'm making those positions available to civilians. And he says that is going to start to change the way that the police department operates to address root causes of crime as opposed to sort of arresting people.
And then, another little nugget in here, the reopening of a Department of the Environment, which is something that progressives had wanted. Cheryl Ray Stout, are you happy that your property taxes aren't going to go up at all, not even with inflation, or are you worried that that means that there's going to be a cliff down the road?
Well, I don't live in Chicago, so I don't have to worry about that. However, I imagine if you are a homeowner, that's one thing you're very concerned with. One of the things I liked about the budget that I saw was adding more jobs for the kids that really wanting to work. Giving them more opportunities, because if you could get these kids feeling good about themselves, earning some money, working, that you could solve some of the problems with them, with the other issues that goes on with the city.
Another big part of Mayor Johnson's plank here. We got to talk about some national politics. Rick Pearson. So Jim Jordan now apparently has gotten the GOP nod to at least run for Speaker now, but does that mean he has the votes to do it, 217?
No, he does not have the votes. There were 81 votes against him in the caucus. It's unlikely that he will get the votes, just the same way that Steve Scalise, who was probably a much more palatable choice, he couldn't get the votes. This is just going to keep continuing. I mean, when you look at Jim Jordan, he's a co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, which is one of the most far-right elements.
Not only that, one of the most unabashed, unapologetic defenders of pretty much everything Trump does. He
Correct.
can do no wrong,
Correct.
according to Jim
And he
Jordan.
was the Trump.
He had Trump's endorsement in this race, and to have 81 Republicans vote against him, I think that caught my eye.
Well, and especially after having lost to Scalise the first round, I don't know that this plays out anytime soon. One of the other things was they wanted a rule to try to keep it all behind closed doors, and you needed 217 to get to be Speaker. That rule got voted down, so then it's all going to roll out on the floor, and it can be a mess.
So there's going to be another continuing resolution vote in less than a month here, a couple weeks actually. What does this mean for that when there's no organization structure in the House to get anything done?
Well, it comes back to playing that same game of who's to blame, who wears the blame jacket if government's going to shut down. And the trouble is, without a speaker, there's nobody to make that legislation happen. They can't conduct regular business unless the House parliamentarian comes up with some clever way to figure out something.
All right, also on national politics, does anyone think it's interesting that Governor Pritzker, who last week sends a strongly worded letter to President Biden saying, please help, you're not doing enough, This week stumps for him. Is he an asset to the president, Heather, politically, do you think?
Oh, certainly. So I think that he spoke out specifically this week because, he's Jewish, he's of Ukrainian heritage, which I think gives him sort of moral standing to speak at a moment when Israel is under attack. And that's why we saw President Biden's campaign blast out his remarks. Pritzker has also shown himself to have some sharp elbows on the national political stage. He said we should not think of President Biden's age as a detriment. We should see him as somebody who has aged into a gem, while somebody like former President Trump has only become worse with age. And that is some straight up political fisticuffs. And for somebody who has been a frequent and robust donor, it does not hurt to have, a billionaire in your back pocket. And that is why President Biden is going to keep him close, although the issue of the migrants is certainly going to cause tension.
Right. Billionaire in your back pocket.
Well,
but
I'd also remind you, too, remember all summer how many times they were here, Biden or Kamala Harris.
Kamala, yeah.
The issue of migrants never came up.
That's right.
And now we got the DNC in 2024, and that's something on Republicans' minds in terms of how that's going to affect what plays out next summer. All right, Connor Bedard, he scores his first goal. Cheryl raced out the super early returns. Is he living up to the hype?
He's really, really one of those players that you like to watch, what he does completely on the ice. But the interesting thing, after he scored the goal and they lost the game, they had a picture of him holding up the goal, and he didn't have a smile on his face. The day before, when they won and they had the assist, he had the smile. The kid understands what he means to the NHL. And the games that they played, they've been playing on national television, they're getting great numbers. And you watch this young man, and he's just got these skills that I think the other players don't know that they have, on the ice. He's very, very, to me, he reminds me of Jonathan Taves, personally. He's got that calm demeanor. He talks to us. He doesn't get high, he doesn't get low. He just really has this way of dealing with the media at 18. He just turned 18. That's such a young age to think that he's doing this already.
Although he's probably been in the spotlight in some form or another,
whole
being a phenom his whole career. Rick Pearson, does that mean...
One thing about that first goal, and it's funny because the way everybody shows the wraparound, but if you saw the play leading up to it starts with him making a backhanded pass, a blind pass, that was part of the setup that eventually led for him to be able to score.
I know you're giddy, Rick Pearson.
And the kid to also watch is Kevin Krasinski, the defenseman. He's got really good skills too, and he's 19. And with Lucas Reichel, who's 21, who's one of their top prospects, those three players are going to be interesting to watch to see them grow.
All right, we're also watching Justin Fields grow as Bears quarterback. The last two games have been pretty good. Can he keep it up against Minnesota?
Well, Minnesota's 1-4 too, so it's not, that's not a real hard. It's going to be interesting because they've lost three of their running backs. And the fact is
there's one of them right there, Khalil Herbert. Is he healthy?
They put him on the injury list. They put him on the
so
injury
he's out.
He's out for 4 weeks at least. So you have that's a kind of a problem because you need that pass protection from your running back. But they have DeAndre Foreman, who's a veteran, so that should help. But the fact is that DJ Moore is really everything that they wanted with a receiver. You want a receiver for Justin Fields, but you're going to see double coverage with him. So Darnell Mooney and Cole Kmet really have to be there to step up.
They have to step up because DJ Moore had 230 yards passing. Darnell Mooney had 0. So now they're going to be the opportunities, and I have to think that defenders are going to try and jump these routes to pick Justin Fields off because he's like so zeroed in.
And they blitz a lot. Minnesota blitz a lot, so it's going to be interesting how the offensive line can handle that too. But I was talking to Darnell Mooney by myself yesterday, and we had a great conversation, and he knows that he's going to be able to get some targets now because everyone is going to be looking at DJ Moore. So it's going to be really important to him after not having any catches the last few weeks, and so that's one to watch.
All right,
being a target's one thing; it's catching it when you are the target is the other.
Yes.
Minnesota 1-4, but they seem like they're better than their record. What's your prediction this week?
They stink.
Do they really?
They really do. They stink. I mean, Kirk Cousins may end up getting traded by the trade dedeadline. That's how,
I thought he kind of nixed that. Didn't he say he wants to exercise a no-trade clause?
But maybe they want him to go because he probably could go to a better situation than what he has right now. He lost his top receiver. Justin Jefferson was the #1 receiver in the NFL. You lose him to injury reserve. That's, for the season.
For them, yeah.
And that's a huge loss for a team like that. So, no, the Bears should be able to win this game.
All right, well, we are out of time, so thank you so much for being here with us. Our thanks to Rick Pearson, Heather Sharon, Laura Rodriguez-Preza, and Cheryl Ray Stout. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Friday night. Don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight and the Week in Review streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website. And join us at 8 for Chicago Stories, The Boss, and The Bulldozer. It follows Mayor Richard J. Daley's rise to power and his refusal to adapt to cultural change. You can watch new episodes of Chicago Stories Friday nights at 8 on WTTW and streaming on the PBS app. Explore the website now at WTTW.com/Chicago Stories. And now for the Week in Review, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe. And have a wonderful weekend, and a wonderful weekend for Tom Skilling. We need to toast him because
absolutely.
what a career, what an amazing career.
Quite a gentleman.
Quite a wonderful gentleman, is enthusiastic and authentic.
If we could all be as enthusiastic about the subjects that we cover.
I don't
as
think
he
anyone
does.
loves anything the way he loves weather. and
he's a
we're the better
journalist-
for it.
And he's a journalist because he tells you the why. It's not just the what.
It was funny. He
gives you
would be
the
at
why.
Sox Park, and he'd have this big area of people just sitting there talking about weather. And you know, you're at a baseball game before the game, and you see this big crowd, and all they want
He's a
is
celebrity.
Especially at Sox Park.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
He's a celebrity, and it's like the most. Someone told me it's the only time you get science on TV. He's
Right.
giving you a daily dose of science every day.
But not I mean, it's
No,
very
everyone loves it.
understandable. It's very understandable.
Have they said who will take over that?
Oh no. Oh no. But it's,
There's no one that can
there
fill
is,
those
there's
shoes.
nobody there's nobody
No one
that
that
can
can
do
fill
that.
those shoes.
Well, maybe he's been training
They'll do AI with him.
AI Tom Skilling to go. Oh, that's,
watch an AI
let's
Tom
not talk
Skilling.
about AI.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Let's not give
right.
anyone any ideas here.
We don't need a head start here
our
for
contracts
this.
don't allow for that.
Right, exactly. But no, and we hope to get him on to Chicago Tonight.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.